In April of 2019, the 30-year reign of Sudan's Omar al-Bashir came to an end. Like previous Sudanese leaders, he was finally toppled by the army, which sided with the people over the president. The country of Sudan itself has had 15 coup attempts, 5 of them being successful. One of them was the 1989 military coup that brought Omar al-Bashir to power. It was al-Bashir's ability to play a skillful combination of internal and external balancing acts plus ruthless repression, as well as a divided opposition, that kept him in power for 3 decades. But eventually it was something as simple and essential as the price of bread that lit the fuse to a challenge to his entire regime and the downfall of his rule of Sudan in 2019. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the rise and fall of Sudan's Omar al-Bashir. Omar al-Bashir was born into a peasant family in 1944 in northern Sudan, which until independence in 1956 was part of the Kingdom of Egypt and Sudan. After finishing high school in the capital, Khartoum, he enrolled in the military academy in Egypt in 1960. At the military academy, he trained as a pilot. Omar al-Bashir graduated from the Sudan Military Academy in 1966 and earned 2 master's degrees in military science from the Sudanese College of Commanders. He studied counterinsurgency in Malaysia as well. During the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Omar al-Bashir served along the Suez Canal as second in command of a Sudanese paratrooper unit attached to the Egyptian forces. It was during this phase of his military career that he began to be thought of as an officer with distinct political ambitions. Omar al-Bashir was also a military attaché to the United Arab Emirates from 1975 to 1979. In the mid-1980s, Omar al-Bashir took the leading role in the Sudanese army's campaign against the rebels of the Southern Sudan People's Liberation Army, the SPLA. In Sudan, the mainly African South had resented the domination of the predominantly Arab North since the independence of Sudan in 1956. This bitter struggle finally led to the independence of South Sudan in July of 2011. Frustrated with the country's leadership, Omar al-Bashir led a successful coup in 1989. This coup was against the Sudanese Prime Minister Sadiq Ahmad, who was on the verge of signing a peace treaty with the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. This peace treaty would have allowed Southern Sudan to be controlled by secular laws instead of the Sharia law that Bashir and other Muslim military officers demanded. Upon taking power after the coup, Omar al-Bashir became the chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation, which ruled the country. Shortly after this, Omar al-Bashir addressed a rally holding a copy of the Quran in one hand and an AK-47 in the other. Addressing the crowd, he said, and I quote, "I vow here before you to purge from our ranks the renegades, the hirelings, enemies of the people and enemies of the armed forces. Anyone who betrays the nation does not deserve the honor of living." This was Sudan's 4th military takeover since independence, and Omar al-Bashir dissolved the parliament, banned political parties, and strictly controlled the press. Throughout this whole process, he was supported by Hassan al-Turabi, a Muslim extremist and leader of the National Islamist Front, the NIF. Hassan al-Turabi had played a prominent role in promoting Islamist ideology during the regime of Khafan al-Meri in the early 1980s. For the first decade of his rule, Omar al-Bashir was seen as a frontman for Hassan al-Turabi. Together they began the process of making the country an Islamic state, and in March of 1991 they introduced Sharia law. This move further emphasized the division between the north and the mainly animist and Christian southern part of Sudan. Southern Sudan rejected the introduction of the new legal system, and the decades-long northern and southern Sudan civil war intensified. The 2 men in charge of the country, Omar al-Bashir and Hassan al-Turabi, intensified the military campaign to defeat the Sudan's People's Liberation Movement in what was called the Second Sudanese Civil War, beginning in 1983 and lasting 22 years. Also during this time, international jihadists flocked to Sudan. Among them was Osama bin Laden, who bought a house in an upmarket Khartoum district and invested in agriculture and construction in the country. With Osama bin Laden, when Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, he had offered to mobilize 10,000 mujahideen to defend the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But to his fury, the Saudi royal family turned to the United States for protection, inviting American troops to establish bases on Saudi soil. After denouncing the Saudi royal family, Osama bin Laden was confined to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. Looking for a new base, he eagerly accepted an offer to relocate to Khartoum, Sudan. Hassan al-Turabi had promised to give bin Laden all the help he needed and to provide him with an office and security guards. Turabi was also keen to assist bin Laden's plan for investing in Sudan and arranged to exempt his construction companies from customs duties on the import of trucks and tractors. He was equally active in organizing insurgent networks, and soon Sudan became notorious as a rogue state supporting terrorist causes. In 1993, the United States government would go to blacklist the Bashir government as an international sponsor of terrorism, and it imposed sanctions 4 years later. This intense diplomatic pressure from Washington, D.C. eventually led to bin Laden being forced out of Sudan and relocating to Afghanistan. In return, the United States provided support for the Sudanese government. In October of 1993, the Revolutionary Council was disbanded and Bashir was appointed the president of Sudan. However, he retained military rule in the country. He would also be confirmed as president by an election held in 1996. Bashir's ally Hassan al-Turabi was also unanimously elected as president of the National Assembly. On June 30, 1998, Omar al-Bashir signed a new constitution which lifted the ban on political parties in the country. In December of that year, however, he used military force to oust Hassan al-Turabi, whom he believed was plotting against him. Omar al-Bashir had Hassan al-Turabi imprisoned. Afterwards, al-Bashir turned back to the army to underwrite his authority, forging relationships that spanned the military, the security forces, and the country's tribal leadership. Omar al-Bashir purposefully attended the funerals and weddings of military officers, often sending presents of sugar, tea, or dried goods to their families. Al-Bashir also used a similar approach to manage provincial leaders and tribal chiefs in the country. His style of a personalist autocracy was put to use in battling the insurgency in southern Sudan, where rebels from different ethnic groups with Christian or animist beliefs were fighting for independence. On March 12, 2000, Bashir declared a 3-month state of emergency, which by stages he thereafter extended indefinitely. After the December 2000 elections, in which he was once again confirmed as president, he went on to dismiss the cabinet. It was also around that same time that Sudan discovered oil. After the first barrels were pumped in 1999, living standards in the country gradually rose in what was then one of Africa's most desperately poor countries. New roads appeared, remote villages gained water and electricity, and shiny buildings rose in Khartoum. In September of 2001, after Al-Qaeda's attack on the World Trade Center's Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, desperate to avoid retaliation, Omar al-Bashir hastened to denounce terrorism and to pledge cooperation with the United States measures aimed at Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. In 2005, under international pressure, Omar al-Bashir signed a peace deal with the rebels of southern Sudan, overcoming opposition from his hardliners who wanted to keep on fighting. But by then, another uprising had erupted in the region of Western Darfur, and this uprising would define Omar al-Bashir's legacy. During the civil war that ravaged Sudan, a separate conflict had remained unresolved, and this conflict centered on the Darfur region in western Sudan. The conflict began in 2003 when rebels launched an insurrection to protest what they contended was the Sudanese government's disregard for the western region and its non-Arab population. Omar al-Bashir's regime then began a campaign to remove the indigenous people from the region, partly because of their earlier support of the Sudan's People's Liberation Movement. The government equipped and supported Arab militias, which came to be known as the Janjaweed, to fight against the rebels in Darfur. The militias, however, also terrorized the civilians in the region and prevented international aid organizations from delivering much-needed food and medical supplies. Despite a 2004 ceasefire and the presence of the African Union troops that followed, by 2007, the conflict and the resulting humanitarian crisis had left hundreds of thousands of people dead and more than 2 million people displaced, internally as well as externally, as they were forced to flee from the fighting. In July of 2008, an international criminal court prosecutor alleged that Omar al-Bashir, as president of Sudan, bore criminal responsibility for the crisis in Darfur. The ICC accused Bashir of orchestrating genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity in the region and sought a warrant for his arrest. The Sudanese government denied the charges and proclaimed Bashir's innocence. Omar al-Bashir was the first sitting president to be indicted by the ICC. A year later, in July of 2010, another warrant was issued for Bashir on the charge of genocide. As a result, his reputation as a villain was amplified across the world by campaigning celebrities like the actor George Clooney, who denounced Omar al-Bashir as the embodiment of a sectarian, ruthless regime. Defying the ICC, Omar al-Bashir traveled to Kenya, Egypt, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia, although a visit to South Africa in 2015 was cut short when a court there considered whether to arrest him or not. As I mentioned earlier, in the year 2011, South Sudan voted to secede, becoming an independent country and taking with it 3/4 of Sudan's oil reserves. As oil revenues dried up, Sudan's economy weakened badly, and Omar al-Bashir started to face serious opposition from within the country. Armed riot police brutally suppressed street protests against soaring food prices in September of 2013, and according to Human Rights Watch, as many as 170 people were killed. Torture and abuse in Sudan's jails also became rampant. But with the slowly worsening of Sudan's economy, the seeds of Omar al-Bashir's downfall were also sowed. In the latter years of his rule, Omar al-Bashir reached wide into the neighboring regions for funding and support for his countries. In 2013, he hosted the then Iranian president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in Khartoum as part of a courtship move by the two countries. 2 years later, he joined the Arab alliance, fighting on one side of Yemen's war led by Iran's arch-enemy, Saudi Arabia. However, back home, by 2018, Sudan's economy was in free fall, with an inflation rate of 72%, long lines at fuel stations, and even a shortage of banknotes. In December of 2018, the government tried to stave off economic collapse brought on by years of United States sanctions and loss of oil revenue by imposing emergency austerity measures and a sharp currency devaluation. As a result of all this economic upheaval, the urban middle classes revolted. For a long time, Omar al-Bashir's recipe of repression and government handouts had worked to keep him in power. But now the people of Sudan had reached a point where they had had enough. So now a protest against the soaring price of bread in Atbara that began on the 19th of December 2018 quickly spread to towns and cities across the country in protests led by doctors and other professionals. Public anger grew as young doctors, some from wealthy families, were killed. In February of 2019, in the face of continued protests, Omar al-Bashir took several actions, including declaring a state of emergency, dissolving the central and state governments, appointing a new prime minister, and banning unauthorized demonstrations. However, this did little to deter the organized protests. At some point, these demonstrators even reached the gates of his home at the headquarters of the Sudanese army in the city. These demonstrations in Sudan soon turned into a daily occurrence. Eventually, the army and security leaders told him that it was time to leave. This was in April of 2019. Within a week, Omar al-Bashir was moved to the Koba prison in Khartoum. Later that month, large sums of money were discovered in his home, which led to formal charges being brought against him for having committed corruption-related acts. He was convicted in December of 2019 and sentenced to 2 years in a reform facility rather than a prison, as Sudanese law did not permit individuals older than 70 years to serve time in prison. He was also charged with incitement and involvement in the killing of demonstrators earlier that year during the protests against his rule. Omar al-Bashir also faced charges for his role in the 1989 coup that brought him to power. That trial against him began in July of 2020. And with that was the downfall of the Omar al-Bashir regime. His critics say that he left the country of Sudan very much in tatters. It remains to be seen though whether his successors can turn around the fortunes of the country. Let me know in the comment section below if you think that Sudan is on the path to recovery. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.